Hello, so good day everyone. This is Joe Brand. Welcome back to the Free Mind. So for today's videos, I'll be explaining another subject for today is readings in Philippine history. So I'll be talking about that. So our lesson number 1, we will be talking about the introduction to history, its definition, its issues, sources, and methodology. So we will get to know what is the real meaning of history, what is the importance of history, how history affects the way we understand ourselves, the way we practice our history. So again, history has always been known as a study of the past. So when we are trying to discover a lot of things, when we are trying to acquire more knowledge about historical events, then we are studying history. So history, it was derived from the Greek word historia, which means knowledge acquired through inquiry or investigation. So when you are trying to conduct a deeper investigation, a deeper inquiry about something, historical events, then you are conducting history. Historia became known as the account of the past of a person or of a group of people through written documents and historical evidences. For example, the life of Dr. Jose Rizal. We are conducting a thorough investigation about that, the life story of the heroes of the Philippines. So we are accounting a lot of people from the past, and also our history also documents a lot of things. There should be some historical evidences and written documents of the past people. So history was also focused on writing about wars, revolutions, and other important breakthrough. So what counts as history? So traditional historians lived with the mantra of no document, no history. So we are living that way. So if we were not able to document or account the people of the past, therefore there is no history. It should be written. It should be documented. Again, traditional historians live with the mantra of no document, no history. So it means that unless a written document can prove a certain historical event, then it cannot be considered as a historical fact. So if there is no written document, then it is not considered as a historical fact. There should be a written document for it to become history. If it is a verbal stories, it is not considered history. No document, no history. So we are living that way. Traditional historians living that way. So history as a discipline has already turned into a very complex and dynamic inquiry. So when you love to inquire a lot of things, to discover a lot of things, then possibly you can become historian someday. So what is history? Why do you need to study history? And history for whom? Why are we studying history? So these questions can be answered by historiography. Again, historiography is the study of history. So when we are trying to study the past events, then that is history. But if we want to study the history of history, so that is considered historiography. History and historiography should not be confused with each other. Okay, so again, history is a study of the past. So history is the study of the past, the events that happened in the past, and the causes of such events. While the historiography, it is the history of the history. The historiography, on the other hand, is history itself. Thus, historiography lets the students have a better understanding of history. They do not only get to learn historical facts, but they also provided with the understanding of the facts and the historian's context. Meaning, history is the study of the past. On the other hand, historiography is the history of history. So historiography, they let our students to understand the history, to learn the historical facts and to understand the facts that is written by the historian's context. That is historiography. Thus, history of history. You are studying the history itself. You are comprehending the history itself, and that is considered historiography. You are not just learning to study of the past. Yeah, you know that. But historiography is the history itself. You are trying to get to know real facts and to understand the facts and the historian's context. So that makes them different. History, again, has played a various roles in the past. Lessons from the past can be used to make sense of the present. Do you agree with that statement? History played a various roles in the past. So as humans, we experience a lot of historical events from our lives. The same with our past people. The same from our heroes of the past. They also get to learn a lot of historical events in their lives. So we get to learn a lot of lessons from the past, and those lessons can be used to make sense of our present. And that is very important, no? If you learn something from the past and you apply it to the present. So learning of past mistakes can help people not to repeat them. I agree with that statement. If you get to learn a lot of things, if you get to learn a lot of, if we commit mistakes in the past, so we are already aware that we will not do that, not to repeat the same mistakes again. So being reminded of a great past can inspire people to keep their good practices to move forward. Okay, so that is the importance why we need to study history. For example, I commit mistakes in the past, so I will not do that again. I will not, for example, if I make mistakes in the past, then I will not do that again in the present. So we learn to get something out of it. So history is very important in our lives, in our daily lives. Learning not to commit the same mistakes over and over again. We are reminded that we need to keep on moving forward despite of our past or bad experiences. So there are various schools of thought that teaches us to value the importance of history. Number one is positivism. Positivism. This is a school of thought that emerged between the 18th and the 19th century. This thought requires, before one can claim that a particular knowledge is true, it needs an objective facts before arriving at a conclusion. So positivism teaches us that before you can claim that this knowledge is true, you need to get objective facts. Before deciding or before arriving at a conclusion, get objective facts. That is positivism. So any history that has been taught and written is always intended for a certain group of audience. So for example, like Dr. Jose Rizal, Isabelo de los Reyes, and Pedro Partino wrote history. They intended it for the Spaniards so that they would realize that Filipinos are people of their own intellect and culture. Dr. Jose Rizal is a very intelligent man, and he loves to write the El Filibusterismo. Or we Filipinos, we are good people and we are people of our own intellect and culture. We preserve our culture, we have great intellect. So that's the importance of history. So another school of thought that teaches us to value the importance of history is the post-colonialism. This is a school of thought that emerged in the early 20th century. So post-colonial history looks at two things in writing history. So first, what is the main purpose during the post-colonialism? The first two things why they wrote history first is to tell the story of their nation that will highlight their identity, free from that of colonial discourse and knowledge. So trying to convey the history of their own nation, why they write history. Number two is to criticize the methods, effects, and idea of colonialism. That's a sense of expression. They write history because they want to tell something. They write history because they want to to tell something or to criticize something and the various effect of colonialism. So one of the problems confronted by history is the accusation that history is always written by victors. This connotes that the narrative of the past is always written from the bias of the powerful and the more dominant player. So when they say that the history is always written by victors, those who are people who are very powerful and more dominant, they are talking about the elite people. They are talking about that history is always written by those people who are more powerful than them. So they always think of history as being biased. So that is the one of the problem of confronted by history. So again, if history is written with agenda or is heavily influenced by the historian, is it possible to come up with an absolute historical truth? Sometimes we wonder, because when you talk about history, it is possibly influenced by those people who are more powerful than you, more dominant player. So is it possible to come up with an absolute historical truth? Although it is being subjective, but for me, yeah, it's possible that what they are written about something, it can also come up with an absolute historical truth. So indeed, an exact and accurate account of the past is impossible for the very simple reason that we cannot go back to the past. So that is one of the problem confronted by history, because we cannot go back to the past, and we just rely on what is written before and we are applying it to the present. So it is very impossible. It is very impossible to get accurate data. It is very impossible to get exact historical truth, because we cannot go back to the past. We are just basing our historical facts based on what they are written way back a million years ago. So we are applying that to the present. And again, we cannot access the past directly as our subject matter, the Maria Clara Anibara. So it is a good thing for us to embrace that fact. But then again, the story is based on the historical, the things that is written up by the historian or the traditional historian. Again, we cannot access the past directly as our subject matter. So historians only get to access representations of the past through historical sources and evidences. Yeah, we cannot go back in time. We cannot access the past. What we can access for the historians is the representation only of the past through historical sources and evidences. Therefore, it is the historian's job is not just to seek historical evidences and facts, but also to interpret these facts. Again, the historian's job is not just to seek historical evidences, documents, but also to be able to interpret these facts. So facts cannot speak for themselves. Again, facts cannot speak for themselves. It is the job of the historian to give meaning to these facts and organize them into a timeline, establish causes, and write history. Again, so if I am an historian, I cannot go back in time. What I can do is to get a lot of representation of the past and try to interpret that and make and organize them into a timeline, establish causes, and write history. That's all we can do as an historian. So the historian is not a blank paper who mechanically interprets and analyzes present historical facts. He is a person of his own who is influenced by his own context, environment, ideology, education, and influences. Again, historians, when we write history, it becomes subjective. Analyzes it the way I was trained, so possibly that could also hamper my own interpretation about something. So my subjectivity will inevitably influence the process of the historical research. In one way or another, history is always subjective. Subjective meaning it depends on how we interpret the facts, and it depends on a lot of things: my representation, my analysis, my interpretation, my ideology, my education, and a lot of influences. So despite the fact that historians cannot as a certain absolute objectivity, the study of history remains scientific because of the rigor of research and methodology that historians employ. Again, even if historians become subjective when you talk about interpretation, when you talk about analyzing the history, we cannot ascertain absolute objectivity, but then again, it becomes very scientific. History is very, very scientific. Why? Because of its extreme research and methodology that we employ, that historians employ. Historical methodology compromises with a lot of techniques and rules that historians follow in order to properly utilize sources and historical evidences in writing history. So, for example, if a historian chooses to use an oral account as his data in studying the ethnic history of the Ifugaos, he needs to validate the claims of his informant through comparing and corroborating it with written sources. Correct. So there's a lot of technique on how we can employ, we can gather a lot of data. Therefore, conducting history is very critical. It needs a lot of logical. It's not easy. So with the past as history subject matter, the historian's most important research tools are historical sources. So if you are an historian, you need to gather a lot of historical sources. So in general, historical sources can be classified between two sources. We have the primary sources and the secondary sources. So talking about primary sources. So primary sources are those sources produced at the same time as the event, period, or subject being studied. So if you are the primary sources, the first sources, you are producing the history at the same time as the event, period, or subject being studied. On the other hand, secondary sources, meaning we are which were produced by an author, we use the primary sources to produce the material. So we are using the primary sources to produce our own material. In other words, secondary sources are historical sources which studied a certain historical subject. Again, primary sources, you are the first sources, meaning you study the event at the same time, at the same period, at the same event. While on the other hand, secondary sources are those sources produced by an author who uses primary sources to produce their own material. So we are using the primary sources as our material. However, again, a student shouldn't be confused about what counts as a primary sources or a secondary source. The classification of sources between primary and secondary depends not on the period when the source was produced or the type of the source, but on the subject of the historical research. So again, both primary and secondary sources are useful in writing and learning history. It is very important to get to know them, to familiarize the primary sources, secondary sources. They are both useful in writing and learning history. However, historians and students of history need to thoroughly scrutinize these historical sources to avoid deception and to come up with the historical truth. So as an historian and as a student, we need to scrutinize historical sources to avoid confusion, to avoid deception, and to come up with the historical truth. So the historian should be able to conduct an external and internal criticism of the sources, especially primary sources which can age in centuries. Again, historians and a student should be able to scrutinize historical facts to come up with a historical truth. It doesn't mean that we are following that and that is true. We need to gather a lot of historical evidences, historical facts to come up with the historical truth. We need to conduct external and internal criticism of the sources. So, what is external criticism? External criticism is the practice of verifying the authenticity of evidence by examining its physical characteristics, consistency with the historical characteristic of the time when it was produced, and the materials used for the evidence. Meaning, we are trying to check the authenticity of the evidence being produced. So, internal criticism. Internal criticism, on the other hand, is the examination of the truthfulness of the evidence. So, internal criticism. So, internal criticism, on the other hand, is the examination of the truthfulness of the evidence. We are trying to look at the content of the source and examine the circumstances of its production. So internal criticism, meaning we are trying to check ourselves. Internal criticism looks at the truthfulness and factuality of the evidence by looking at the author of the source, its context, the agenda behind its creation, the knowledge which informed it, and its intended purpose, among others. Again, external criticism, we are trying to verify the authenticity by examining its physical characteristic, while internal criticism is we are trying to examine the truthfulness of the evidences given to us. So that's what makes them different, the internal criticism and the internal criticism. So again, the task of the historian is to look at the available historical sources and select the most relevant and meaningful for history and for the subject matter that he is studying. So history is not just a simple history. History needs a lot of scrutinizing, needs a lot of analysis, needs a lot of interpretation, needs a lot of checking on historical facts to come up with historical truth. So history, like other academic discipline, has come a long way but still has a lot of remaining tasks to do. It has come a long way. History. It does not claim to render absolute and exact judgment because as long as questions are continuously asked and as long as time unfolds, the study of history can never be complete. So again, the task of a historian is to organize the past. The task of the historian and the student is to organize the past that is being created so that it can offer lessons for nations, societies, and civilization. It is the historian's job to seek for the meaning of recovering the past, to let the people see the continuing relevance of memory, remembering, and historical understanding for the present and the future. So again, as what I've discussed, history has never been an easy task to do. There's a lot of things to do, and we are trying to recover the past meaningful events and trying to apply that to our present and to recover the past to let the people see the continuing relevance of our historical facts or is to come up with a good historical truth. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that you are learning from all the videos that I've posted. This is our lesson number 1 for our subject readings in Philippine history. I hope you get to learn something about what is history, what is the purpose of conducting history, the methods, the issues of history. There's a lot of issues confronted with history, and hopefully you get to learn something a bit about our lesson number 1. Thank you so much for listening. I'll see you again for my next video blog. Thank you.